Miko Peled is a peace activist who dares to say in public what others still choose to deny. Born in Jerusalem in 1961 into a well-known Zionist family, his father, Miko Peled, was a young officer in the War of 1948 and a general in the War of 1967, when Israel conquered the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights, and Sinai. Miko's unlikely opinions reflect his father's legacy. General Peled was a war hero turned peacemaker.
It's time to sweep away some of the myths and to uncover the truth so that we can finally live in peace together. And so the three myths that I like to uncover, the three probably most popular myths, the most common myths: the myth of 1948, the myth was that there was a country without a people. And then the myth of the existential threat of 1967. And then finally the myth of the Israeli democracy. Growing up, we were taught to believe that the Arabs had left Eretz Israel, partly on their own and partly at the directive of their so-called leaders, and that therefore taking their land and taking their homes was morally okay. It never occurred to us that even if they did leave willingly, we had no right to prohibit their return. But then Israeli historians had found that, just as Palestinians have been saying for decades, none of this was true. And it's interesting that when Palestinians claim something, we tend to doubt it. But then when Israeli historians come up and say the exact same thing, well then, now we accept it. As though the Palestinian word is not good enough. And so Israeli historians had confirmed that Israel was created on the ruins of Palestine. Now, obviously Palestine was not a state yet at the time. We're talking about 1948. But it would have been a state very shortly thereafter had it not been so completely destroyed. That had bustling cities, it had a middle class, it had trade and commerce. Palestinians had judges and scholars, and they had a rich political life. They had all the characteristics of a state to be. But the one thing in which they didn't invest, the one thing in which Palestinians did not have, was the military. Any kind of militia. And so when the Jewish militias attacked, even though the Palestinians constituted the vast majority of the population, when the Jewish militias attacked, they were helpless. The Jews, on the other hand, in Palestine at the time, were a minority, probably less than 500,000, but they had put together state-like institutions. So they had their own schools, they had their own universal healthcare system, for example, they had a quasi-government of which my grandfather was a member, and all of these were created based on the principle of hafradah, which in Hebrew means segregation. In other words, to be completely separate from all the institutions that the Palestinians had had. And the one thing that they did, in which they did invest heavily, was a very strong militia. A militia of young men, well indoctrinated, well trained, of which my father was a member. And they were determined to create a Jewish state in Palestine, completely disregarding the fact that the majority of the population were not Jews, but were Palestinian Arabs. It turns out that the creation of Israel had not, after all, been a haphazard fight in which the Arabs fled their homes due to the directives of their own leaders. It had been an unprovoked, systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing by the Jewish militia, involving massacres, terrorism, and the wholesale looting of an entire nation. Now it's interesting, my mother was born and raised in Jerusalem. She was born in 1926. And she recalls the Palestinian neighborhoods in West Jerusalem. And when the residents of these neighborhoods were forced to leave their homes, which are still in Jerusalem, they're beautiful, spacious homes with beautiful gardens, were offered to Jewish families And one such home was offered to her, being the wife of an officer and so forth. And she refused it. She said she could not bring herself to move into the home of a family that had been forced out and is now living in a refugee camp. She also said, and I heard this confirmed by many people, that when the Jewish forces came into the homes, the coffee was still warm on the table. The people had just left. And then the looting began. And again, she recalls seeing the truckloads of furniture and rugs and what have you being taken away from those homes. Another widely accepted Zionist myth is that in 1967, Israel faced an existential threat where the armies of 3 Arab countries were invading, and miraculously the Jewish forces were able to beat them all and conquer huge, huge, huge tracts of land. Now, setting aside for a moment the fact that countless books have been written in Hebrew and English and Arabic and other languages, and that documentaries have been filmed disproving this completely and showing that the purpose of the war was conquest. In my own research in preparation for this book, I spent days at the Israeli Army archives. And I read from the minutes of the meetings of the Israeli General Staff, the top IDF, top brass, and the things that were said during those meetings. And I want to quote from my book one such passage. In a stormy meeting of the IDF top brass in the Israeli cabinet that took place on the 2nd of June, 1967, my father, General Miko Peled, told the cabinet in no uncertain terms that the Egyptians needed at least a year and a half in order to be prepared for a full-scale war. His point was that the time to strike a devastating blow against the Egyptian army was now, not because of an existential threat, but because the Egyptian army was not prepared, and it was an opportunity to destroy it once again. The other generals agreed, but the cabinet was hesitant. The prime minister was not sure a full-scale war was the right thing to do, and a tug of war of unimaginable proportions ensued. During that same stormy meeting, my father said to the prime minister, President Nasser, referring to Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, President Nasser is advancing an ill-prepared army because he's counting on the cabinet being hesitant. He's convinced that we will not strike. Your hesitation is working to his advantage. Later on, he accused the Prime Minister of insulting the army, this army that had never lost in battle, by not allowing the army to attack right now. So there was never any mention of an existential threat, just an opportunity to once again assert Israeli strength. In the end, the cabinet succumbed to the enormous pressure placed upon them by the general, and they decided on a preemptive strike that began on June the 5th, 1967. And again, I want to quote from my book. The surprise attack led to the total destruction of Egypt's air force, the decimation of the Egyptian army, and the reconquest of the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula in a matter of days. The Israeli army also knew that the Syrian army was in shambles and the Jordanians were no match for the IDF strength. After the campaign of Egypt went so smoothly, the generals turned their attention to the West Bank and the Golan Heights, two regions that Israel had coveted for many years. Both regions had strategic water resources and hills overlooking Israeli territory. And the West Bank contained the heartland of biblical Israel and the crown jewel, the old city of Jerusalem. In 6 days, it was all over. Arab casualties were estimated at 15,000. That's 15,000 dead in 6 days. Israeli casualties were 700. And the territory controlled by Israel had nearly tripled in size. Israel had in its possession not only the land and resources it had wanted for a long time, but also the largest stockpiles of Russian-made arms outside of Russia. Israel had once again asserted itself as a major regional power, or as the neighborhood bully. Now here's something of immense proportion that takes place, and take into account that this is over 4 decades ago. And again I quote, "At the first weekly meeting of the General Staff after the Six-Day War, Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin was beaming with the glory of victory. But when the meeting was nearing its end, my father raised his hand. When he was called on, he spoke of the unique chance the victory offered to solve the Palestinian problem once and for all. For the first time, he said, in Israel's history, we were face to face with the Palestinians without any other Arab countries between us. Now we had a chance to offer them a state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip." He claimed with certainty that holding on to the West Bank and people who lived in it was contrary to Israel's long-term strategy. Popular resistance to the occupation was sure to rise, and Israel's army would be used to quell that resistance with disastrous and demoralizing results. It would turn the Jewish state into an increasingly brutal occupying power and eventually into a binational state. And this is precisely the reality in which we live today, nearly 4.5 decades after that. So does anyone seriously, can we really expect that 5 million Palestinians will keep living under a regime that is democratic to Jews, but is brutally oppressive towards Palestinians, with about 6 million Jews and about 5 or 5.5 million Palestinians living under the same rule, under the same government, but with different laws? My father, who was a military expert, had spent the remainder of his life after he retired from the military fighting for justice for the Palestinian cause. And being a former military man, he was often asked about Palestinian terrorism. On one such occasion, when he was being interviewed by the Israeli television, he said this about terrorism. He said, "Terrorism is a terrible thing, but the fact remains that when a small nation is governed by a larger power, terrorism is the only means at their disposal." My father's predictions have all come true. Now, the work of the Israeli lobby in the United States notwithstanding, more and more people around the world are beginning to realize that there are in fact 2 nations who live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, and that the conditions under which Palestinians live are completely unacceptable. Recently we had an event here in San Diego, which was a vigil to remember those who were killed in Gaza by the Israeli army. And as this vigil was taking place, there was a large contingent of Israeli supporters. We were separated from them by a line of police and what I think is a sense of morality. And they were dancing and singing as those of us that were at the vigil tried to recall the names of 1,400 people that were killed. These were 3 weeks of such death and destruction that one can hardly comprehend. And I remember the stories of the Israeli Air Force pilots who flew sortie after sortie, dumping hundreds of tons of bombs on a civilian population in Gaza, and would then return home to celebrate the festival of Hanukkah. See, because the attacks in Gaza at the end of 2007 took place during the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. Then, these same pilots, having celebrated with their families, slept in the comfort of their beds, got up the next day, and did it again and again and again.